Okay. There is a kind of weariness that is peculiar to adults. Children don't feel weary like this, not in this way, and especially known by older adults. No one else knows about this weariness except the truly experienced, except those who have suffered or have felt that over their lives they've worked especially hard. These alone can talk about this kind of weariness because they know. And this assignation is to people who've lived a bit and who have perhaps lost a bit of paint along the way. A.D. Hope lamented, "Why is it that just when I'm getting good at my trade, all of my tools are worn out?" Does that sound familiar? They say that the antidote for anger is actually humility, and that the cure for pride is gratitude. We can't feel proud and grateful at the same time. But how do we cultivate such life-giving attitudes in the unfairness of a real world and a church environment that feels to us like it is grinding us down sometimes? The story of the prodigal son was, in Leo Tolstoy's opinion, the greatest story ever composed. In his opinion, all the masterful elements of a story are there. If you've ever read any Russian authors, any Russian literature, you will know how wonderful it can be, but also how verbose, how wordy it often is. Russian authors seem to take forever to get around to making their points. Here in the parable of the prodigal son, Jesus delivers such rich meaning, and Tolstoy was a big fan. Not a word is wasted or without significance in just 21 memorable verses. Tolstoy went on to write a stage play version as a kind of homage to Jesus' storytelling prowess. His play faithfully reproduced the parable pretty much exactly as Jesus told it, with the only major change being that Tolstoy wrote one additional piece, kind of tacking it on to the last scene. When Jesus concludes the parable, Tolstoy noticed that it finishes kind of up in the air where the whole thing started. It concludes with a remonstration, which is a pleading of one's case. The father is the one remonstrating. The father is remonstrating in the field, pleading in the field with the older son, who must have been feeling quite put out that there's a big party being put on for someone who has, in his estimation, been very unfaithful to the family. He, on the other hand, certainly sees himself as having sacrificed his own enjoyment for the sake of the family business for many years. The father pleads with his faithful eldest son. Giving a defense of his generosity, the father says, "But we had to celebrate because this brother of yours has come back to life." And that's where the magic of the story ends. The two figures arguing about the unfairness of grace and forgiveness out in the field. And if you can imagine the theatre of Jesus' delivery for just a moment, when he had finished speaking, Jesus was sort of back in the room, if you like, back in the street. The setting, he was going up to the Pharisee's house for lunch when he told this story. And with the models for the younger sons, the people who modelled the attitude of the younger sons, the tax collectors and the sinners, they were drawing near, pressing near on Jesus to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes, they're kind of the back of the pack, whose attitudes are, in fact, the model for the older son. are looking on indignantly, sort of tut-tutting. Jesus is responding with this story to them. That is, the Pharisees, who are grumbling and demanding that Jesus answer the question, why does this fellow welcome sinners and eat with them? This is why, says Jesus, because these sinners that you despise are actually brothers and sisters of yours, and the invitation is for you to be delighted with me, for they are coming back to life. Tolstoy believed that Jesus left the ending kind of hanging up in the air, an unfinished story, if you like, with that argument out in the field. But he also thought that the remainder of the gospel story actually provided an ending of sorts to this parable. And so he went ahead and kind of speculated and retold it in a stage play like this. Having a reverence for the specialness of Scripture, Tolstoy instructed that a semi-transparent curtain be brought down after the biblical part of the story ended. He then backlit the stage with limelights so that the figures of the father and the older son, previously live and three-dimensional theatre, were now reduced to two-dimensional silhouettes and dramatically cast up larger than life on the cheesecloth screen in front of the audience. The playwright also had the figures fall silent, not wanting to add any words to scripture. And what followed was very short and powerful action reflecting Tolstoy's own dramaturgical genius. The two figures are arguing together, their body language reflecting a rapid deterioration in the situation. The older son figure stands increasingly tall and proud, crossing his arms resolutely against the shadow of the imploring father. The father figure sinks lower and lower, assuming a position of pleading beneath the towering and now menacing older son. The father lifts his hands like a prayer to his eldest son, who then responds by reaching down to the ground, picking up a branch and raising it above the father's head. Clearly, he means to bring it crashing down and to kill his father. And just before he does, he turns the stick a little, revealing in the silhouette projected up on the cheesecloth curtain the shape of a cross. He brings it down on the grovelling father's head, at which Tolstoy had all the limelights extinguished with blankets. The stage was made black while the house lights in the theatre gradually came up. The special effects achieved with this low tech, the insight into the text's impressive statements, are testaments to Tolstoy's talent, intellect, and his flair for truly prophetic exposition. But of course, that's only Tolstoy's ending. And I like to think that Jesus might have left the ending up in the air for a very kind reason. Perhaps it was to suggest it doesn't have to end this way. A narrative therapist might say, if this is a story of your life so far, this story, and it's not finished, how would you like to write the next chapter? How would you like this story to end for you? If you are an older brother, it needn't be such a tragedy. I think this is a story of our lives, us older people in the church, and it challenges us to substantial healing through an invitation to attitudinal change. It may also be a story about our time and place and about our church life, amongst other things. For it is a story about that most poisonous and insidious of human affectations, resentment. It's a story about compassion fatigue, about hard work and the experience of growing old and a bit grumpy. It's a story about the forces we get swept along with in the hectic space of late modern capitalism, where everybody's working too hard, by the way. Fitzgerald said that capitalism was like standing in front of a blazing fire. Kind of makes your cheeks glow. It also includes and rebukes the part we may be playing as gatekeepers in the decline of our Western institutions, including in the decline of the church. Some public theologians have started to notice that the story not only warns against falling into an attitude of resentment, which is a poison, and it's a party killer. Remember that older brother wants the party stopped. But also that the story debunks resentment's puffed up claims to be a communication of reality. You know, we're just telling it like it is. This is the realist's truth, that claim. This is what the politics of resentment, which has been a blight on our age, falsely claims, thus enabling it to deceitfully validate its claims and then destructively dismantle so much of our cultural heritage, including the church. So how do we avoid the trap of resentment and be culture builders instead of culture wreckers? The first task, according to Miroslav Volf, a public theologian, is that of remembering what has happened rightly, to remember rightly. It is important, he writes, not only that we do remember, but how we remember. Do we remember with love, or do we remember with hate? When we go looking in our memories for recollection, are we seeking reconciliation, or are we going after a kind of a rap sheet in our quest for revenge? As Amos Elon put it, remembrance can be a form of vengeance. In the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15, verses 12 to 13, Jesus gives the narrator's version of exactly what the younger son did. There are two versions. Listen to this is the first one. This is the one Jesus gives. He said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." And then he gathered all that he had and he travelled to a distant country and there squandered his property in dissolute living. That's the first version. Now, Wolf insightfully points out that in the later version of these events, which is given by the resentment-filled older son, as he is remonstrating with his father in the field, the misdeeds of the younger son are actually exaggerated by him. It's very important. The older son insists that he worked like a slave for the father, but he fails to mention that he worked for himself because he was the heir of 2/3 of the property. As an heir, he's going to get the benefit of all of his hard work. And being the oldest son, he gets 2/3. And he claims that his younger brother devoured the father's property. This is sensationalism. He devoured the father's property, but he fails to tell that what the younger brother devoured actually belonged to the younger brother. He was the heir of 1/3 of the property. That's how it worked. Most significantly, though, he projects onto his brother evil his brother did not commit. The brother's dissolute living, which in Jesus' original seemingly implied no tremendously lurid immorality, he makes into, in order to incriminate his younger brother in his father's eyes, he says, he has devoured the property with prostitutes. The older son sensationalizes the misdeeds of the younger son in order to defame him. And as a consequence, he reduces the moral ambiguity and complexity of everybody, which we all have. None of us are all good or bad. He reduces all of this and renders the world black and white, the black hats and the white hats, goodies and baddies. In other words, the indignant remembering of those who feel resentment at having been victimized can, if left unchecked, tend towards a reduction of the world's players into the good and the evil. And the moral universe is cast in stark contrast, the world in black and white. This is juvenile thinking, but it's where we are as a society, I think. For people who have been frightened or threatened, this is, of course, biologically driven. When we're trying to survive, we don't see peripherally. We only focus on the threat, of course. It's how we get away with our lives. But when there's chronic anxiety, we lose our ability to listen. We lose our ability to see. In the case of post-traumatic difficulties, because of a crisis that has been experienced before, is therefore forever anticipated, people can become quite narrow and vengeful in their thinking. And of course, we need to stop beating ourselves up for our biology. We can't help this. It's the way we're made. Bishop Butler, even in the 18th century, was wisely advising that the natural emotion of resentment can become vicious or unnatural in three basic ways: due to some distemper of mind, due to bad reflection, or due to the conscious refusal to reflect at all. It wasn't natural resentment of wrongdoing that Butler asked us to renounce. That keeps us safe. But it was the indulgence of this natural response in an unself-critical manner, in a manner that makes scapegoats and exaggerates. All this leads us to reflect more honestly. Remembering with unreflected upon resentment can serve self-righteous and pariah-making exercises. Part of managing our resentment might be to be more meticulous in our remembering, to make sure we do all we possibly can to remember correctly and not wrongly. Bishop Butler said we should not do what modern studies call discounting, that is, to gloss over or diminish the crimes of those who have offended against us. This, he said, can give evil an unhealthy level of unspoken approval. However, I think this is the danger we're in today, neither should we allow our resentment to continually exaggerate the misdeeds of our oppressors. You can see how resentment is allowed, even encouraged, but the Christian thing, the life-affirming behaviour, is the nuanced and truthful management of this resentment. It is entirely possible that Jesus felt resentment and allowed himself to feel it powerfully, but he ruled out the taking of revenge. So the wrongdoing stopped with him. And what is clear from the story of the prodigal son is that there is an attitudinal difference between the spirit of the older son, if you like, and the spirit of the younger son. And Jesus is saying, look, it's the spirit of the younger son that we need to learn from here. And that difference in attitude enables the younger son to experience the celebration, the hospitality, and the warmth of heaven. He's inside the room having the party while the older son's out in the field, in the cold presumably, and out in darkness, literally. That's what Jesus is saying. The older son has consigned himself there, and that's really important. The older son consigns himself to outer darkness. He's not sent there. In fact, the Father, who is God, begs him to come out of his self-imposed isolation. And the son actually refuses. So in his way of doing things, if this parable is anything to go by, God sends no one to hell. This is good news. But people may separate themselves from his love if they so choose, though God will implore them not to, and also provide them with every opportunity to let go of bitterness and come on in. Furthermore, entry into heaven requires only that we leave our sense of needing to have our hard work acknowledged, as if we'd earned our entry, behind us at the door. We all must learn, whether we're older or younger sons, like children already know how to do, to receive God's heaven and God's love as pure gift, or else we will have refused it, for that is actually what it is. It's easy to see how destructive for the self the spirit of the older son can be. It destroys him in the end. But it is understandable too. In fact, it's probably our default position as human beings. In a work environment I was once part of, there was a strong sense of pressure to be productive. This was a place with thousands, more hundreds of employees. And there was strong pressure to be productive members of this enormous team. The team was so large that this pressure was often conveyed in general terms. A sort of a one-size-fits-all kick in the pants was often delivered. It was applied to everyone at once, regardless of whether they'd tried hard or whether they had in fact been taking it a bit easy. Interestingly, and you'll recognise this if you've been in one of these environments, those who had been coasting took the pressure and chastisements fairly well. Well, they thought, fair enough. The people who felt most aggrieved by the rhetoric of criticism from the top were the ones whose earnest efforts, it seemed to them, went largely unnoticed. I saw a poster up in someone's room. It said, "Doing a good job in this institution is like doing a wee in a dark blue suit. You yourself get a lovely warm feeling, but no one else notices." They didn't feel noticed. They didn't feel affirmed or honoured in what they were doing. And what they took from that is that what they were doing was not encouraged or wanted by the body they were serving and enriching. Having put in an extraordinary effort, they felt, if not exactly that thanks were owed to them, then certainly not that they should be told off along with everyone else. The result was, of course, that they became extremely angry at the constant rebukes and criticisms and violences coming down from on high, from senior management. And sadly, some of them occasionally quit on the spot, to the great detriment of this organisation. This weakens institutions. This is terribly toxic stuff that goes on. To the great detriment of the organisation, the people who did what they had to do and no more survived the constant diet of criticism and messaging that you can do better. And they survived in one piece. And they often stayed quite calm within the organisation until they achieved quite high position and inevitably became the organisation's managers. And by contrast, those who habitually went the extra mile, of course, they didn't last as long. And they often found themselves far more discouraged and full of resentment and anger. And then they often went elsewhere, hoping to find a place in which effort might be met with a more appropriate praise, incentivization, and at least it would be seen. With people committed to not doing much more than they had to at the very top and defending that kind of behaviour, the stage is then, of course, set for an even less welcoming approach to excellence. Employers often think that if they're not critical, people will get slack. And this little this piece is saying criticism is actually quite corrosive if it's not actually targeted properly. People committed to not doing more than they had to at the top, the stage was set for an even less welcoming approach to excellence in that place. And so the situation just goes from bad to worse. So that's a tragedy, but that's another story. But if this kind of management and leadership doesn't work in a setting of paid employment, which was what that was, it is even less likely to be effective in voluntary settings. voluntary settings such as a church or an op shop or whatever it is we're trying to organise or get done. Of course, we all work for someone, unless we're one of the very few who are truly independently wealthy. People think bishops are their own boss. They're not at all. They're constantly responding to deadlines, to things they have to do for people. It's only the really, really fortunately independently wealthy, the genuinely independently wealthy, who are not really living with this kind of anxiety. And what would be ideal, it seems to us, would be that the systems and institutions we are beholden to would duly see what we and our colleagues are doing for them. Wouldn't that be good? And then reward our efforts, and so on and so on. So, given that this bitterness, which is the spirit of the older brother, let me say it's the same thing. Given that this is a set of emotional responses that we so often find ourselves tripped up by, let's be brave in this last little bit and sample, for our healing, a bit of countercultural insight from the New Testament world, which is not the same as our world. Early Christianity was not written to the powerful. It wasn't written to the bosses or the elite who had the wealth. It wasn't written to those who had agency over their decisions and could then adjust the settings. If you like, it wasn't written to the independently wealthy. Early Christianity was, by and large, a religion of the underclasses or the working classes. Its scriptures, by and large, were not so much addressed to those who could actually do something to change the world or the way in which they are governed, but more often to those who could only do something about the way they responded to what others did to them, because they were the ones who were constantly on the receiving end of what others did to them. It was written, this New Testament thing, to the socially powerless, by and large. That's why Jesus advised, when someone presses you into service saying, "Carry my cloak for 1 mile," carry it for 2. This is advice to the powerless. It's also why Paul wrote, "Slaves, submit to your masters." Both of these are, you think about our age of rights and entitlement and anger and resentment. These texts are truly hard for us to grasp for ourselves, and even harder for us to preach from the pulpit. What does it mean to submit to those who are giving us a hard time? And even more importantly, what does it mean to those we're advising to do this? Are we putting them in harm's way? And so, was Paul advocating for a retention of the practices of slavery? Absolutely not. The Christian insistence on the inherent dignity of the human being, God's image bearer in the world, would, over the course of time, and it would take a long time, eventually, we know, militate for the abolition of such unjust and dehumanizing practices. But it took the church to establish itself and have people in high places like William Wilberforce to accomplish such amazing things. The point is that Paul or Jesus weren't writing or speaking at the time to the owners of the slaves, not in these verses anyway. They were addressing people whose enslavement was simply there, just a fact of their lives, an immovable fact. They were being advised by Jesus and Paul how to live as freed people, even though in this world and for the time being, for good or for ill, they just happen to be enslaved. They were being advised on how to live as freed people, in spite of the obvious fact that for the time being and in this world, temporarily, they were enslaved. For Paul and Jesus, there wasn't much point in talking about standing up for your human rights, which were already foregone by dint of the economic situation in the empire, but instead to articulate to their readers and hearers the secrets of living creatively within oppressive structures, and without having that oppression seep into our souls to ruin and embitter and consign us to the spirit of the older son, to anger, resentment, ill feeling. It seems to me that if we begin with the assumption that our society today is essentially Christian, if we say, oh, that was the Roman Empire, they kept slaves and we don't, and, they didn't know what they were doing and we do, and obviously we're a Christian society now, we would naturally assume that our society and our governments are obliged to be fair and just and good, and they are obliged by God to do that. The question is not whether they're obliged to do it. The question is whether we have the power to make them or not. Many of us in the West have been raised to believe that the systems on which we are governed are wise and good. Now, certainly the systems under which we are governed may be grounded in wisdom and goodness and a moral code which is good, but it's not nearly as clear that they're always reliably used for wisdom or goodness. Max Weber famously questioned, we need to read Weber in the church before we just go along with the world's latest angry outbursts and self-righteousness. Max Weber famously questioned our blithe assumption that in our Western society we're basically non-violent or less violent than other societies. He proposed that in the case of modern Western society, all we've really done is group the violence all in one place. We've reserved the use of violence to the state. You or I may not go and arrest someone or imprison them or not so many decades ago, hang them from a set of gallows. We're not allowed to do that. But the state was and did with impunity. Weber floated the idea that the state has what he called monopolized the use of violence, reserving it to itself, usually through its police forces, and reserving to itself the right to dispense this violence in order to give real force to its version of morality and social codes of conduct. Now, but what if these are not calibrated correctly? Or, even more importantly, what if, as Nietzsche was fond of saying, notions of justice are habitually corrupted and annexed by those who, through their own resentments and rivalries, are seeking a socially acceptable form of revenge? These questions, of course, are so huge and so important for our time that a much more focused discussion would be needed to even go anywhere near answering them. But if there is even the slightest justification for them being posed, isn't it time that we as a church thought differently about the responses we are giving upon the discovery of injustice in our own lives or in the life of our loved ones or in our community? How do we respond to injustice? Do we go and see our local member? Is that what Jesus would do? In other words, it may be more fatuous than we thought to lobby or campaign for justice to be done at a governmental level, or indeed from any seat of power and control. What if we tried a different approach altogether, a kind of a bottom-up approach from where we actually are in this equation? One much more in tune with the messaging of the New Testament, which was written to those who didn't have the power to change the politics, but only themselves. What if we tried to deal better with the experience of injustice? And when we encounter others who may be victims of oppression, what would be the results of, instead of trying to rescue them and fix their problems like we can, instead of advocating for systematic change on their behalf as if anyone will listen, as if we could give effect to this change, as if we really were any more powerful and influential than we really are? I'm not. What about you? What if instead of using all that hot air and energy, we opted first for helping them survive the experience of victimization spiritually intact? And emotionally intact. And that of course entails the signature Christian idea, which is not morality. There's moral codes all over the world, every religion, and even places where there is no religion, there are strict moral codes. Most of them look very similar. It entails the signature Christian idea, which is not justice, but forgiveness. Both the offering of forgiveness and learning to receive it as the older son needed to do. That is, learning to let go of our sense of having worked for reward and living instead as a forgiven people, free of resentment, being more graciously disposed towards the demands others place on us. This, as we know, is basic to the grammar of the gospel, the parable of the unforgiving servant, the parable that we've just been talking about of the resentment-filled older son. And it's a worrying development that the emphasis in recent years evident in the writing and campaigning of thinking Christians, particularly since the horrors of World War II, has understandably been on agitating for social justice rather than teaching human beings the art of forgiveness. You see, social justice is what you tell powerful people to do. Forgiveness is what you tell the powerless to do, so that their souls aren't destroyed by bitterness. It's not to make them victims. It's to stop the victimization of them being so final that it poisons their spirit. There are good reasons to try it out, though, this forgiveness thing. Because to practice forgiveness in the context of us feeling we're owed recognition or reward for our hard work unburdens us from a very heavy load that we are carrying. It is to dispense with entitlement. Oh, what a great thing to not feel anymore. To dispense with its heaviness and to dispense with the resentment-filled hell entailed in the wounded ego of the older brother. And instead, to deliberately and consciously clothe ourselves with humility, to clothe ourselves with the gratitude, the freedom, and the lightness of the younger brother who, after looking around and counting his blessings, which we all need to do, finds himself at the end of the story the grateful, celebrated guest at a wonderful party. As Neil Diamond sang once in his wonderful, humane songs, being lost is almost worth the coming home. I'll leave it there. Thanks.